so that it looks something like this. This structure here then is just a really big version of the axon terminal of the sending neuron. This structure here represents the dendrite of the receiving neuron. Right? So the dopamine would be made by this structure, and then it would travel towards this structure. So first of all, we'll take a peek at how the levels of dopamine can be increased. One of the things that's associated with an increase in the amount of dopamine is a particular type of amino acid called tyrosine. And so what the brain can do with tyrosine is convert it to another molecule called dopa. And there is an enzyme that catalyzes this conversion. The name of that enzyme is tyrosine dehydroxylase. What can then be done with this dopa is that, well, it turns out that it's the dopa then that can be directly converted into dopamine. And so the dopamine that's generated, that's synthesized in the rough endoplasmic reticulum, it ends up budding off that rough ER after it's produced. So that's why it has a membrane around it. There's an enzyme that catalyzes this conversion from dopa to dopamine, and the name of that enzyme is called dopa decarboxylase, or we'll just abbreviate it DDC. And so after, again, this dopamine is produced, the way that it actually ends up leaving the axon terminal is that the membrane that it's surrounded in ends up fusing with the membrane of the nerve cell that produced it. And after that fusion occurs, it then facilitates the release of the dopamine molecule. All right, so again, what we're doing here is showing you one way that dopamine levels can be increased in the synapse. And one way of doing that is by making it using the tyrosine amino acid. So we'll just list it here. What are the different ways that dopamine levels can be increased? One is by just making more of it from tyrosine. Another way of making dopamine, and maybe making it is not the best term to use, more another way of maintaining the levels of dopamine is by recycling it. So after this dopamine has done its job, after it's caused some sort of effect on the dendrite of the receiving neuron, it can be recycled. And so by recycling, what we mean is that this dopamine is taken back in by the neuron that released it. And so in order to go back into this neuron, there has to be a protein pore to facilitate its movement back into that neuron, kind of like this. And so after it's inside, it can be recycled and then used again in the future in order to stimulate the dendrite of the receiving neuron. Just the general term for this protein pore that allows dopamine to go back in to the neuron that produced it, it's called a dopamine transporter. So we're just making a list here. How are dopamine molecules produced? Another way of doing it, if you're not going to make it from scratch, it can just be recycled. So it can be reabsorbed and recycled. And again, it goes in via this dopamine transporter. What if the body then needs to decrease the levels of dopamine? How does that happen? So we'll show you two ways here. One way of decreasing the amount of dopamine is to use an enzyme that breaks it down. And so it turns out that this neuron that produced the dopamine can make an enzyme that breaks it down. And the name of this enzyme, it's called Monoamine Oxidase, or MAO is the abbreviation we'll use. And again, its job is to break down that dopamine if the body doesn't need it. All right, so we'll make a list also for how our dopamine levels decreased. One way is it's broken down by monoamine oxidase. Another way of decreasing the level of dopamine is this. So after that dopamine is released into the synapse, and after it binds to this dendrite of the receiving neuron, and specifically where it contacts or where it binds to that dendrite is via a receptor, which is called the dopamine receptor. After it's bound to that dopamine receptor, and after it's had an effect on the receiving neuron, it turns out that the receiving neuron makes an enzyme that can then break down that dopamine. And the name of the enzyme that's produced by the receiving neuron is called catechol-O methyltransferase, or COMT. is the abbreviation that we'll use. And again, it breaks down dopamine as well. So another way that the levels of dopamine can be decreased is that it can be broken down by COMT. So now we've just shown you how how dopamine affects the body and how the body can increase or decrease the levels of dopamine according to its needs. So what we'll do next is kind of bring this all together now. So the whole reason why we're talking about this is we're going to try to figure out how smoking affects the body. Right? And so nowhere in this picture have we shown smoking or the effects of smoking yet. And so we'll do that right now. So smoking affects this whole process. And so you might be wondering, how does inhaling cigarette smoke affect brain cells? Right? That seems like kind of a big gap between those two things. Well, keep in mind that whenever someone inhales a cigarette, the smoke and then everything within the smoke ends up going to the lungs. Whatever is in the lungs, then that material can diffuse out into the blood, and the blood then delivers the contents of that cigarette smoke, for example nicotine, to the brain, where you'll find the nerve cells that we were just talking about. Right? So that's how the contents of cigarette smoke get up to the nerve cells in the brain. The way that smoking affects this, so again, one of the chemicals found in cigarette smoke is nicotine. And so nicotine, it turns out, has a very similar structure to acetylcholine, and so you might see where this is going, right now. We just mentioned that the levels of dopamine can be increased or decreased depending on the body's needs, and one of the things that triggers the release of dopamine is the presence of acetylcholine. So if there's no acetylcholine around, that means that that's kind of the body's natural way of decreasing the amount of dopamine around. Here's the thing, if someone is smoking though and has a whole bunch of nicotine around, that means because its structure is very similar to acetylcholines, it can also just as easily bind to those dendrites of the sending neuron and cause the release of dopamine, even if the body really doesn't mean to release dopamine. So we mentioned that releasing dopamine kind of affects the ability for someone to feel pleasure. So one of the reasons why smoking can be addictive is because it causes the release of dopamine, which causes the feelings of pleasure. Right? So basically here we've just taken a peek at exactly how smoking affects the body. And so hopefully by taking a look at this, you can then answer these your homework questions that asks about some of the genes that might be responsible for addictive smoking behaviors.